evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're setting sail for a place that shows up in every world history textbook, but almost never the way it actually was. A place of white stone temples baking under a merciless sun, of philosophers arguing in the shade of olive trees, and of a relationship between bodies, beauty, and the divine that most modern retellings quietly edit out. Tonight, we're talking about ancient Greece, and specifically about something your school textbook almost certainly skipped over: the astonishing, well-documented, culturally central place that love between men held in Greek civilization. Not hidden, not whispered, painted on drinking cups, argued about at dinner parties, written into the greatest poem in the Western canon. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this kind of slow, detailed history, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. And thank you, as always, to the person who requested this topic. You know who you are, and it's a wonderful one. Now, get comfortable. Turn the lights down low. Let the fan hum in the background. Pull the blanket up. We have a long night of ancient history ahead of us. Let's start with the questions worth sitting with in the dark. Did the Greeks really live the way historians claim? Was desire between men simply an ordinary fact of life, discussed at dinner the way we discuss the weather? Did anyone ever object? Was there shame anywhere in this picture? Or did shame simply attach itself to different things than it does today? Could two men walk arm in arm through the marketplace without a second glance? And what changed when Rome eventually swallowed the Greek world whole? You have just opened your eyes in ancient Greece. It's the 5th century before the Common Era. The heat is already pressing down. The wine, weak with water, is already being poured somewhere nearby. And someone, somewhere close, is almost certainly quoting a poet or picking a fight about the nature of justice. Possibly both at once. Welcome. Before we go further into anything intimate, we need to set the stage honestly, because ancient Greece is a phrase that hides an enormous amount of variety. It was never a single nation. It was a scattered constellation of independent city-states, fiercely proud, fiercely competitive, and often at each other's throats. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each with its own laws, its own customs, its own certainty that everyone else was doing civilization wrong. You've woken up, most likely, in Athens, because Athens is where the richest records of everything we're about to discuss survive. The light here has a particular quality, a hard, clean blue that doesn't quite have an English name. The air already smells of crushed olives and dust. Someone nearby is grinding barley for the morning meal. A donkey somewhere is complaining loudly about its lot in life. If you're a free adult male of respectable standing, your house is modest. A handful of small rooms wrapped around an open central yard. Furniture is sparse. And that's because in Athens, the home isn't really where life happens. Life happens outside in public, among other men. In the marketplace, the wrestling grounds, the law courts, the theater, the temple steps. A man's real existence unfolds where he can be seen, argued with, admired, and judged by his peers. women of citizen families lived a very different life, largely confined to the household. Enslaved people, and there were a great many of them in Athens, performed the physical labor that kept the city functioning. The free adult male citizen, at least in theory, was left to pursue the higher occupations: politics, philosophy, athletics, and war. Now walk 20 miles south into the territory of Sparta, and you'd think you had entered a different civilization entirely. Spartan society ran on almost the opposite set of values. Where Athens prized clever speech and personal beauty, Sparta prized toughness, obedience, and the ability to endure suffering without complaint. Spartan boys were taken from their families at the age of 7 and raised communally by the state in a brutal training system built to produce soldiers, not orators. Spartan women, in a detail that surprises most people encountering it for the first time, had considerably more freedom than their Athenian counterparts. They exercised in public, owned and managed property, and were expected to be physically robust. Corinth was the wealthy cosmopolitan cousin of the Greek world, a shipping and trading hub famous for its temple to Aphrodite, and frankly, for its thriving commercial sex industry. And Thebes, often overshadowed by its two more famous neighbors, would eventually produce one of the most extraordinary military experiments in ancient history, which we will come to later tonight. What tied all these separate, squabbling city-states together wasn't a government or a flag. It was a shared language, a shared pantheon of gods, interpreted somewhat differently from place to place, and a fierce collective pride in being Hellene rather than barbaros, a term the Greeks used for anyone who didn't speak Greek. The word supposedly imitated the nonsense babbling, bar. That non-Greek speech sounded like to Greek ears, not the most generous assessment of the rest of the ancient world. This is the civilization you have just woken up inside of. Brilliant, unequal, endlessly argumentative, and utterly convinced of its own cultural superiority. And nestled inside all of that intellectual and civic energy is a set of beliefs about love and desire, so different from what most of us were taught to expect, that understanding them properly requires setting aside nearly everything we assume about how sexuality and identity work. So let's begin at the beginning, with a discovery that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it. The ancient Greeks had no word for homosexuality, not because the underlying experience was absent. It plainly wasn't, but because their entire mental map of desire was organized around completely different lines than ours. The term homosexuality itself is a startlingly recent invention. It was coined in 1869 by Caroly Maria Kurtbeny, a Hungarian-born writer and journalist, as part of an argument against Prussian anti-sodomy laws. Before that word existed, no European language had a single term for the idea that a person's essential nature might be defined by an attraction to the same sex. That absence isn't a gap in the historical record. It reflects a genuinely different way of dividing up human experience, organized around actions and roles rather than fixed identities. Ancient Greek had a rich vocabulary for specific relationships and specific roles. A word for the older partner in a mentoring relationship, a different word for the younger one, words for aching desire, words for admiration, and one especially important word, Eros, nomming both a driving, overwhelming force of attraction and the god who personified it. What ancient Greek never developed was a term that sorted human beings into two permanent camps based on the gender of who they wanted. That particular organizing principle for human sexuality simply hadn't been invented yet. Consider what that absence really means. Without a linguistic category splitting people into those who desire the same sex and those who desire the other sex, you don't get a framework in which one type of person is understood as intrinsically different from another. There is no concept resembling the modern idea of sexual orientation as a facet of personal identity. Instead, desire is treated as something that happens to a person, that can flow in more than one direction over a lifetime, and that is governed by expectations of dignity, restraint, and social role, rather than by which sex is involved. This is not to suggest ancient Greece operated as some boundless erotic utopia. Rules absolutely existed, and they were enforced, sometimes through reputation and gossip, sometimes through formal law. But the axis along which those rules were drawn looked almost nothing like our own. What mattered enormously was social status. What mattered was age. What mattered was whether you occupied the dominant or the submissive role in a given relationship. The sex of your partner mattered far less than any of these other considerations. Upshot is a civilization in which what we would today call same-sex attraction was neither hidden nor treated as extraordinary. It runs through the poetry, the philosophy, the mythology, and the daily texture of Greek social life so thoroughly that later, more prudish eras found the evidence almost unbearable. 19th century translators, encountering unmistakably romantic Greek verse, addressed from one man to another, sometimes quietly swapped pronouns, or buried the meaning in a defensive footnote. They were not misreading metaphor. The Greeks, characteristically, meant exactly what they said. Naturally, the Greeks assigned a god to this force. His name was Eros, and long before he shrank into the chubby arrow-slinging cherub of later European art, he was something stranger and vastly older. One of the first entities to come into being at all, a raw cosmic power binding the universe together. To say you had been struck by Eros wasn't a cute, romantic turn of phrase. It described something that arrived from outside yourself, disorienting and largely beyond your control. The poet Hesiod, writing around the 8th century BCE, placed Eros among the very first beings to exist, alongside chaos, earth, and the murky underworld, well before the familiar cast of Olympian gods had even emerged. Eros, in this earliest telling, was the pull that draws matter together, principle that makes living things seek each other out. The reason a person can look across a crowded room and feel abruptly, uncontrollably interested in a total stranger. The Greeks were not speaking figuratively when they called this force divine. They meant it with complete literalness. Desire, to them, was not a personal eccentricity. It was a fact woven into the structure of the cosmos. By the classical period, Eros had picked up a more specific mythological profile. He was understood as the son of Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and desire, and he carried two kinds of arrows, gold-tipped ones that kindled passion, and lead-tipped ones that snuffed it out. He was mischievous, occasionally cruel, and thoroughly indifferent to whether his interventions were convenient for anyone involved. This tells you something important about how the Greeks understood their gods generally. They were not moral role models. They were forces of nature given personality. And as a force, Eros made no distinction whatsoever based on the sex of the people he struck. Aphrodite's own domain was correspondingly far broader than the narrow modern sense of romantic love. She presided over beauty, physical pleasure, the magnetic pull between people, and the kind of longing that drives a person to do something they privately know is unwise. Myths about her interventions cover men desiring women, gods desiring mortals, and described with the same casual seriousness, desire between men. She was never framed as a goddess, specifically of heterosexual romance. She was a goddess of desire, full stop, operating across every combination of people the Greeks could imagine. The Greeks also drew careful distinctions between different categories of love, and this vocabulary is worth pausing on because it's genuinely more sophisticated than most modern equivalents. Eros was passionate, often destabilizing desire, the kind that arrives without invitation and rearranges your priorities overnight. Philia was the steadier affection of friendship and companionship, built through shared experience and mutual respect. Storge described the bond between parents and children, and agape, a term that would later take on enormous theological weight in early Christianity, described something closer to broad goodwill, extended toward humanity in general. Crucially, the Greeks understood these as genuinely distinct phenomena, each valuable on its own terms, each obeying its own internal logic, and not mutually exclusive. A single relationship could contain both Eros and Philia simultaneously. In fact, the relationships that most fascinated Greek philosophers were precisely the ones where burning initial desire matured over time into something deeper: mutual knowledge, shared virtue, a bond tested by hardship and proven durable. This maturation was considered the highest form of human connection available, and it was discussed in relation to bonds between men every bit as readily as any other kind of pairing. For an ordinary Athenian walking through the marketplace, Eros wasn't some abstract philosophical concept. It was a working explanation for lived experience. Catch sight of a striking young man training at the gymnasium and feel your thoughts rearrange themselves around him. The Greeks had a name for that: untouched by Eros. There was no shame attached to this. If anything, it was treated almost as a mark of good character, evidence that you were capable of perceiving beauty, and perceiving beauty was itself treated as a kind of virtue. The Greeks held, with genuine philosophical seriousness, that beauty wasn't merely pleasant to look at. It pointed towards something true and good about the underlying order of the universe, and that a person drawn toward beauty was, in some real sense, being drawn toward wisdom itself. This is the philosophical bedrock underneath everything else we'll discuss tonight. When Plato's characters spend an entire evening debating the nature of desire, they aren't indulging in idle chatter. They're working through the practical consequences of a worldview in which desire and philosophy are not separate compartments of life, but deeply, inescapably intertwined. A worldview in which the question, what does it mean to want something, leads directly into the much larger question, what does it mean to know something at all? If you wanted to understand how educated Athenian men actually thought through questions of beauty, desire, and philosophy, there was no better place to look than a symposium. Not a modern academic conference, a drinking party. Reclining couches, garlands of flowers, wine cut with water, and the standing expectation that someone in the room would eventually say something worth remembering for the next 1,000 years. The word itself simply means drinking together, and the format was tightly ritualized. Guests arrived at the host's house after dinner had already been eaten elsewhere. The symposium itself was about wine and talk, not food. You'd be led to a couch and expected to recline on your left side, propped on one elbow, right hand free for your cup. Anywhere from a handful to 30 guests might be present. The host, or a designated master of ceremonies, chosen by lot, decided the ratio of water to wine for the evening. Drinking wine undiluted was considered borderline barbaric, the mark of someone who didn't understand moderation. A flute girl, almost certainly enslaved, provided music from a corner of the room. Sometimes there were acrobats or dancers. Sometimes a drinking game called katabos, in which guests flicked the dregs from their cups at a target, believed to reveal something about the flicker's romantic fortunes, depending on how the wine landed. It was, by any honest measure, a genuinely good party, but it was also serious business. Political alliances were formed here. Careers were made through wit and destroyed through foolishness. Young men were brought into the company of their elders and quietly evaluated for their potential. Everything happening in the room operated simultaneously on the social, political, intellectual, and erotic level, without any sense of contradiction between those layers. The physical arrangement of the room encouraged intimacy by design. Couches were shared. The space was small enough that everyone could hear everyone else. Wine kept the evening's guard low. The whole architecture pushed toward disclosure, toward the kind of conversation you wouldn't have standing upright, sober, in broad daylight in the marketplace. Desire was simply present at these gatherings as a matter of course. Attendants were often chosen partly for their looks. Poetry recited over the course of the evening frequently concerned longing, beauty, and the people who couldn't stop thinking about them. To be visibly moved by a beautiful guest at a symposium wasn't embarrassing, it was expected. To claim indifference to beauty was regarded, in a sense, as a philosophical failure, an inability to perceive what was plainly there in front of you. At the same time, restraint mattered enormously. The point of the evening wasn't simply to act on every impulse. That would have violated one of the central Greek virtues, self-control. The point was to feel the presence of beauty fully, and to channel that feeling into conversation, connection, and thought that elevated everyone present. Desire supplied the fuel. What you did with it measured your character. Somewhere around 385 BCE, Plato composed a dialogue so strange and so enduringly human that people are still arguing about it today. The Symposium. It's set at a dinner party where several prominent Athenians, including the comic playwright Aristophanes, the physician Eryximachus, and eventually Socrates himself, take turns delivering speeches in praise of Eros. The occasion is a celebration at the home of the tragedian Agathon, marking his first victory at a dramatic competition. The guests, still nursing hangovers from the previous night's festivities, agree to drink moderately and instead entertain each other with formal speeches about the god of love, who they jokingly complain has been shamefully neglected by poets up to that point. The first speaker, Phaedrus, argues that Eros is among the oldest of all gods, and that love is uniquely capable of inspiring virtue, particularly courage in battle. A man being watched by someone he loves, Phaedrus claims, will fight with everything he has rather than disgrace himself. An army built entirely from pairs of lovers, he suggests, would be unbeatable. This wasn't idle theorizing on Phaedrus's part. It reflected a genuine belief held across much of the Greek world, one that Thebes would eventually test in actual practice, as we'll get to shortly. The physician Eryximachus follows with a speech connecting Eros to the broader natural world, treating desire as a principle of harmony operating throughout nature, not confined to human hearts. Then comes Aristophanes, whose contribution is strange enough and important enough to deserve its own full discussion later tonight. Agathon speaks next, offering a beautifully worded but somewhat shallow tribute to Eros as the most beautiful of all gods, which Socrates then dismantles, politely but thoroughly. And then Socrates speaks, though true to form, not entirely in his own voice. He instead relays a conversation he once had with a woman named Diotima, a philosopher from Mantinea, whom he credits as his teacher on the subject of love. This detail alone is worth pausing on. In a culture that offered women almost no public intellectual platform, Plato has his central philosophical figure attribute his deepest understanding of desire to a woman's teaching. Whether Diotima was a real historical figure, or a literary device remains genuinely debated among scholars. What isn't in dispute is the enduring influence of what she's reported to have said. Diotima's teaching, as Socrates recounts it, runs roughly like this. Desire begins with attraction to a single beautiful body. Pursued correctly, though, it doesn't stop there. It leads outward to an appreciation of beautiful bodies in general, then upward to beautiful souls, then to beautiful institutions and laws, then to beautiful knowledge itself, and finally to an encounter with beauty as an abstract, eternal, unchanging principle from which every particular beautiful thing derives its beauty. This image, sometimes called Plato's ladder of love, transforms erotic attraction into the starting point of a philosophical journey. The pull you feel toward an attractive person isn't a distraction from wisdom on this account. Followed properly, it's the very beginning of the path toward it. The dialogue closes with a burst of chaos. The door bursts open, and in stumbles Alcibiades, drunk, garlanded in ivy, and determined to deliver a speech not about Eros at all, but about Socrates, which is how the most philosophically serious meditation on love to survive from the ancient world ends, with a charismatic, tipsy Athenian general explaining, at length, exactly why he finds Socrates both utterly maddening and utterly impossible to stop thinking about. 2,500 years later, it still lands perfectly. Now we need to address something directly, without softening it, and without pretending it fits comfortably into a modern moral framework, because doing so is essential to understanding Greek society honestly. Among elite Greek men, particularly in Athens, there existed a formalized social institution historians call pederasty, a relationship between an adult man and an adolescent boy, understood as simultaneously educational, social, and in many recorded cases, physically intimate. It was publicly acknowledged. It was governed by widely understood, if unwritten, rules of conduct, and by any modern standard of consent and appropriate boundaries between adults and minors. It was not something we would consider acceptable today, and it's important to say so plainly, rather than dress it up in academic distance. The Erasts, the older partner, was typically a man in his 20s or 30s. The Eromenos, the younger partner, was typically in his mid to late teens. The arrangement was public, often treated by families as a normal part of a young man's social and moral education, expected to instill discipline, connect him to influential adults, and shape him into a capable future citizen. Historians studying this institution are clear that it cannot be translated cleanly into modern ethical terms, and that softening it with euphemism does a disservice to honest history. Understanding what the Greeks believed the institution was doesn't mean endorsing it. It means being honest about what the historical record actually shows, because without grappling with it directly, enormous portions of Greek philosophy, literature, and civic life simply don't make sense. Within the framework the Greeks themselves described, the older partner carried real obligations to guide the younger person's education, to open social and political doors for him, to model what mature, honorable manhood looked like. The community evaluated these relationships publicly, not merely on whether they existed, but on whether the older man behaved with restraint and honor, and whether the younger man's character appeared to be genuinely improving as a result. The record also shows Greek society building in its own internal rules around physical conduct within these relationships. Certain acts considered acceptable, others considered degrading to the younger partner, and therefore forbidden to any man claiming to act honorably. That such rules existed at all is itself revealing. It suggests that Greek society implicitly recognized the vulnerability and power imbalance built into the arrangement, even without articulating it in the terms we would use today. None of this makes the institution acceptable by modern standards. It does make it comprehensible as a historical phenomenon, and comprehending it is necessary groundwork for understanding why Greek writers could discuss love between men with such warmth and philosophical depth elsewhere in their culture. Sparta, characteristically, built its own version of this institution with considerably more discipline and considerably less philosophical commentary attached to it. The bond was called the Ispnelas relationship, embedded directly into the agoge, the harsh, state-run training system that transformed Spartan boys into the soldiers the rest of Greece feared. The word itself translates roughly to one who breathes in, describing the older man's role as a kind of model, whose virtues the younger man was meant to absorb. The agoge began at age 7, when a Spartan boy was removed from his family and placed into a communal training cohort. He slept outdoors regardless of season, was deliberately underfed, and was expected to make up the shortfall by stealing food, with punishment reserved not for the theft itself, but for being caught, since getting caught demonstrated a lack of skill. Regular beatings served not as discipline for specific offenses, but as general conditioning for pain and endurance. Into this brutal system, Spartan custom placed a formal mentorship bond between a mature warrior and a younger trainee, one that ancient sources describe as carrying an openly recognized erotic dimension. The relationship was public and acknowledged by families, and tellingly, if a young trainee behaved dishonorably, his mentor could be held responsible alongside him, which tells us how seriously the bond was taken as a shaping force in a young man's development. Sparta differed from Athens in another notable respect. Spartan women held considerably more public freedom than their Athenian counterparts. They exercised and competed athletically in public, managed property and estates, and were expected to be physically robust, since Spartan ideology held that strong mothers produced strong soldiers. Ancient sources hint, more thinly than for the men's system, that a parallel mentorship tradition existed between older and younger Spartan women, though the documentation here is considerably sparser. Partly, historians suspect, because ancient male writers were simply less interested in recording women's lives in detail. The Spartan system produced, by every ancient account, soldiers of extraordinary quality, men trained since childhood to feel a personal bond with the man beside them in the battle line, for whom retreat or cowardice would have meant betraying not an abstract cause, but a specific, deeply known individual. Sparta had no patience for philosophy for its own sake. It had no Plato, no Symposium tradition of reclining men debating the nature of desire deep into the night. What it had instead was a ruthlessly practical program for producing warriors, one that had discovered, empirically, that bonds of loyalty and affection between men made those warriors far harder to break. Once you understand this Spartan logic, the extraordinary military unit we're about to discuss, the Sacred Band of Thebes, stops looking like a strange historical anomaly and starts looking like the logical culmination of an idea multiple Greek city-states had already been developing in different forms for generations. That love between men could function, quite literally, as a weapon. In the 4th century BCE, the city-state of Thebes fielded a military unit, unlike anything else the Greek world had produced, one that baffled and unnerved its enemies in equal measure. It was known as the Sacred Band, 300 elite soldiers, organized into 150 pairs of male lovers. The logic behind it was simple, and in practice, devastatingly effective. A man fights harder beside the person he loves than beside anyone else. He will not retreat and abandon him. He will not leave his body on the field. For close to 4 decades, the Sacred Band never lost a battle. And when its end finally came, it came in a way that turned into legend almost immediately. The unit was founded around 378 BCE, traditionally credited to the Theban statesman Gorgidas, though it reached its greatest fame under the later command of the general Pelopidas. The idea drew directly on a thread of Greek thought we've already traced tonight Phaedrus's argument in Plato's Symposium that an army built from pairs of lovers would be unbeatable. And the practice Sparta had already been quietly running for generations. Thebes simply took that intuition and made it the deliberate organizing principle of an elite fighting force to see what would happen. What happened was remarkable. At the start of the 4th century BCE, Thebes was not a great power. It had spent years under Spartan domination, its citadel occupied by a Spartan garrison after Thebes' surrender at the close of the Peloponnesian War. The Sacred Band formed part of a broader Theban revival, a deliberate attempt to build something formidable out of a city the dominant powers of Greece had largely written off. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the Sacred Band fought as the spearhead of a Theban force that did the supposedly impossible. It defeated the Spartan army in open battle. Sparta had not lost a major land engagement to a fellow Greek army in over a century. At Leuctra, that reputation shattered in an afternoon, with the Sacred Band engaging and breaking the elite Spartan infantry directly. The The shockwave through the Greek political world was immediate. Sparta's aura of invincibility evaporated. Thebes briefly rose to become the dominant power in Greece. And the sacred band, 300 men bound in pairs, was celebrated across the Greek world as the force that had made the impossible happen. The band went on winning for another generation, until it finally met an enemy that even devotion couldn't overcome. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, it faced the reorganized Macedonian army of Philip II, with his 18-year-old son Alexander commanding the cavalry on one flank. Facing a new and lethally effective tactical system, the sacred band held its ground and refused to break even as the battle collapsed around it. Every member of the unit died in formation. Philip II, who had spent time as a young hostage in Thebes and knew exactly who these men were, is said to have wept at the sight of the 300 bodies still arranged in their battle lines, and to have declared that anyone who imagined these men had done or suffered anything shameful ought to be ashamed himself. They were buried at Chaeronea, where a stone lion still stands over their grave to this day. Now let's turn to the island of Lesbos, somewhere around the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, where a woman named Sappho was composing lyric poetry of such precision and physical honesty about her desire for other women that fragments of it have survived 2,500 years and still stop readers cold. She appears to have led some kind of community or school for young women, and she was celebrated across the ancient world as one of the finest lyric poets who ever lived, writing openly, without any apparent embarrassment, about longing for, losing, and grieving the women she loved. Frustratingly, little of Sappho's work survives. She reportedly composed 9 books of lyric verse, along with wedding songs and other occasional pieces. But what remains today is mostly fragments, a handful of nearly complete poems, and many others reduced to a line or a phrase, preserved only because later writers quoted them as worth remembering. We know she existed, that she was renowned in antiquity, that she was compared favorably to Homer. About the highest compliment the ancient world could pay a poet, and that she came from Mytilene on Lesbos. Beyond that, almost nothing about her personal life is known with any certainty. One of her most celebrated surviving poems, often referred to by its opening words, describes watching a woman across the room talking and laughing with a man, and the physical wreckage that sight produces in the speaker. The tongue failing, a fire spreading beneath the skin, the eyes going dark, a ringing in the ears, a cold sweat, the whole body trembling. It reads simultaneously like a precise clinical account of a panic response and an unmistakable confession. Ancient readers understood exactly what Sappho was describing. Plato reportedly called her the 10th muse. The poet Horace later held her up as a model of lyric perfection. She was not a marginal or embarrassing footnote in Greek letters. She was canonical, celebrated, and commemorated. fact that she wrote about desire for women was known and apparently unremarkable to most ancient readers for centuries after her death. Her name and her home island have given the modern world two words still in daily use: Sapphic and lesbian. That kind of linguistic afterlife is rare. To have your name become a permanent fixture of human vocabulary for an experience you simply lived and wrote about honestly. What her actual community of young women looked like in practice remains genuinely uncertain. It may have been a religious community connected to worship of a particular goddess, an informal school preparing elite young women for adult social life, or simply the natural social circle of an unusually gifted and connected woman. Ancient sources don't agree, and modern scholars remain divided. What does seem clear is that she formed deep, specific, named attachments to particular women, and that losing those attachments produced grief she wrote about with an intensity that has never really dated. Before we go further into Sappho and the question of women's experience of desire in ancient Greece, we need to be honest about the wider context surrounding her, because Greek women, particularly in Athens, lived under significant restriction. They were largely confined to the domestic sphere. They didn't attend symposia. They couldn't vote, and in most cases couldn't own property, and had no direct voice in the philosophical debates their male counterparts were conducting about beauty and desire. The relative freedom that elite Greek men enjoyed in expressing and discussing desire simply wasn't extended to women in the same way. The Athenian ideal for a respectable woman was, bluntly, invisibility. In his famous funeral oration, the statesman Pericles told the widows of Athenian war dead that the greatest honor available to a woman was to be talked about as little as possible, neither praised nor blamed, simply unmentioned. This was offered, remarkably, as a compliment. The less a respectable woman appeared in public discussion at all, even favorably, the better she was considered to be performing her role. It's difficult to imagine a more efficient system for erasing an entire half of a population from the historical record, and you'd struggle to design a better one if you tried. Athenian women of citizen status lived largely within the gynaikeon, the women's quarters of the household, managing domestic affairs, supervising enslaved workers, raising children, and taking part in a handful of religious festivals. Among the few occasions when women moved through public space in organized groups, marriages were arranged by fathers or male guardians, typically when a girl was in her mid-teens, to a husband considerably older, and she had no legal standing to object. Once married, legal authority over her simply transferred from father to husband. Her expected role was to produce legitimate heirs and manage the household competently. This picture applies specifically to Athens, and specifically to women of citizen status. Elsewhere, and for women outside that class, the picture looked different. We've already noted that Spartan women enjoyed considerably more freedom and public respect. And in Athens itself, a separate class of women, the heterae, educated courtesans, often born outside the citizen class, appear in the historical record in ways respectable citizen wives almost never do. These women moved through elite male social circles, attended symposia, engaged directly in philosophical conversation, and were sometimes among the most intellectually accomplished women in the city, precisely because they received an education denied to citizen wives. Aspasia, the companion of the statesman Pericles, was reportedly sharp and politically astute enough to draw open attacks from comic playwrights and political rivals alike. Evidence, at minimum, that she was visible, opinionated, and taken seriously enough to be worth attacking. The gap between official Athenian ideology about women and the actual textured reality of women's lives, once you look closely, turns out to be significant. Women played substantive roles in religious life. Women poets existed beyond Sappho, even if she remains by far the most famous. Some philosophical schools, notably the Pythagoreans, are recorded as including women among their members. The official rhetoric of female invisibility and the messier reality underneath, it didn't line up perfectly, which is generally true of official ideologies about any marginalized group throughout history. What remains true, though, is that the philosophical and literary tradition that shaped how the Greeks talked about same-sex desire was overwhelmingly a conversation among men. For men, the surviving texts, the reconstructed symposia, the entire philosophical inheritance that would go on to shape Western thought. These are largely products of a male intellectual world that excluded women almost entirely. When we discuss ancient Greek openness towards same-sex desire, we are, for the most part, discussing male desire documented by men for a male audience within a culture that simultaneously celebrated Sappho's genius on one hand and confined its own wives to the household on the other. That contradiction is real, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than smoothed over. The Greeks, naturally, had a goddess presiding over all of this, and by any measure, she was one of the most powerful and unpredictable figures in the entire pantheon. Aphrodite governed desire in every form it took: desire between men and women, desire between men, the kind of ruinous obsessive passion that could bring down entire cities, and the quieter, steadier tenderness that made ordinary life worth living. She was not a gentle or comfortable deity. She played favorites. She punished those who failed to honor her properly. And the myths surrounding her personal life are recounted by ancient sources with visible enthusiasm. Her origin story alone signals what kind of goddess she was. In the older, stranger version of the myth, Aphrodite was born from sea foam that gathered around the severed remains of the sky god Uranus, cast into the ocean by his own son Cronus. She rose from the waves, already fully grown, already devastatingly beautiful, carried to shore already a goddess of complete power. This is not the origin story of a soft domestic deity. It's the origin story of an elemental force, born out of violence, arriving without warning, impossible to contain or ignore. Greek artists returned to this image obsessively. Aphrodite rising from the sea, serene and luminous, apparently untroubled by the violent circumstances of her own creation. It became one of the most reproduced images in the entire history of Western art, echoing forward through the centuries into works like Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Itself, the descendant of a tradition that reaches back to a very old, very human need to give desire a face, and to give it a form that could be honored and appeased. She was also, by every account, genuinely dangerous to cross. The myth of Hippolytus illustrates this clearly. He devoted himself entirely to the virgin goddess Artemis and refused to honor Aphrodite at all. Her response was to cause his own stepmother, Phaedra, to fall into a consuming, catastrophic passion for him. A chain of events that ended in Phaedra's death, Hippolytus's death, and lasting grief for his father, Theseus. The lesson embedded in the myth wasn't subtle. Desire could not simply be opted out of without consequence. It demanded acknowledgement. Crucially, Aphrodite was never framed as a goddess of desire, specifically between men and women. Her domain, as we've said, was broader than that. She governed the full range of what the Greeks understood as Eros. And Eros, as we've already established, wasn't organized around the sex of the people involved, but around its intensity, quality, and the roles the participants occupied within it. The same goddess who blessed a marriage was understood to bless the bonds celebrated at the Symposium. The same divine force behind Paris's disastrous passion for Helen was understood to operate in the desire between men that Greek philosophers spent so much energy analyzing. There was even a philosophical distinction drawn, particularly in Plato, between two aspects of the goddess. Aphrodite Urania, heavenly Aphrodite, was associated with love between men, understood as the higher, more philosophically productive form of desire, the kind that led toward wisdom rather than mere physical gratification. Aphrodite Pandemos, common Aphrodite, governed desire between men and women, understood as oriented more toward reproduction and physical pleasure, and therefore ranked somewhat lower on the philosophical ladder. This distinction says a great deal about the tendency of elite Greek male intellectual culture to locate the highest forms of everything, including love, within the male homosocial world. But it also confirms that both forms of desire were understood as genuinely sacred, both squarely within Aphrodite's protection. There was no version of Greek religious thought in which one category of desire was blessed and the other condemned outright. One of the most striking features of Greek comfort with desire between men is how directly it was written into their mythology, all the way up to the king of the gods himself. Zeus, ruler of Olympus, wielder of the thunderbolt, guarantor of cosmic order, was said to have become so captivated by a beautiful Trojan youth named Ganymede that he transformed into an eagle, swept down to earth, and carried the boy up to Olympus to serve as cupbearer to the gods. This story was never treated as scandalous. It was told and retold in poetry, painted on pottery, carved into temple decoration. It was simply understood as part of who Zeus was. Ganymede, according to ancient accounts, was tending his father's flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida when Zeus first noticed him, described in the Iliad as the most beautiful of mortal men. What followed happened swiftly. Zeus either transformed himself or sent his sacred eagle, depending on which ancient source you consult, and the boy was carried up to Olympus, made immortal, and given the honored role of pouring wine at the feasts of the gods. His father was compensated with a gift of divine horses, and by all accounts, everyone involved considered this a perfectly reasonable resolution. The myth appears constantly throughout Greek visual culture, on painted vases, in sculpture, in architectural decoration. As one of the standard mythological scenes, artists returned to again and again. It survived intact into the Roman period, where it continued to circulate freely. The constellation Aquarius was sometimes identified with Ganymede in antiquity, and the largest moon of Jupiter, the planet the Romans named for Zeus, still bears his name today, given to it by Galileo in the early 17th century. Few myths survive so many centuries of cultural transition so completely intact, which tells you something about how deeply embedded it was. What matters here is the significance of Zeus's role in the story. He wasn't a marginal or morally questionable figure in Greek religion. He was the supreme authority in the entire cosmic order, the father of gods and men, the guarantor of justice and law. His desire for Ganymede was never treated as a scandal that undermined his dignity. It functioned, if anything, as proof of the sheer scale of Ganymede's beauty, evidence that even the most powerful being in existence could be moved by it. Other gods carried similar stories. Apollo, god of the sun, music, prophecy, and poetry, was said to have loved a Spartan youth named Hyacinthus with great intensity. Hyacinthus was also desired by Zephyrus, the west wind, whose jealousy of Apollo's attention led to tragedy. While the two were throwing a discus together, Zephyrus redirected it with a sudden gust, striking and killing Hyacinthus. Grief-stricken, Apollo caused a flower to spring from the spilled blood, the hyacinth, which still carries his name. It's a story of divine love, divine jealousy, and divine grief, organized entirely around a god's desire for a beautiful young man, and it's told in Greek sources with exactly the same emotional weight given to any other tale of love and loss in Greek mythology. Poseidon was said to have loved a youth named Pelops, whose story became the founding myth behind the Olympic Games. Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, is credited in various traditions with multiple male loves across his long and eventful life. The pattern repeats throughout Greek mythology. Gods desired men, gods desired women, and both forms of desire were treated as equally natural parts of divine existence, equally capable of producing both great joy and great catastrophe. This mattered because mythology in the ancient world wasn't simply entertainment. It functioned as theology and as a working model for human conduct. When Zeus's desire for Ganymede was recited at a symposium, it operated partly as divine precedent, proof that the desire felt by the men in that very room wasn't merely tolerated, but sanctioned all the way from the top of the cosmic order downward. Homer's Iliad is, on its surface, a poem about the Trojan War, the rage of Achilles, and the terrible cost of pride in conflict. But running through the entire second half of the poem, like a current beneath the surface, is the relationship between Achilles and his companion Patroclus, a bond that ancient Greek readers and many modern scholars since have understood as one of the great love stories in Western literature. The two men are described as inseparable. When Patroclus is killed, Achilles' grief is total, overwhelming, and unlike anything else in the poem, he stops functioning as a person entirely. He refuses food. He lies in the dust and screams. Homer never uses explicit romantic vocabulary to describe the bond between Achilles and Patroclus. He doesn't need to. The depth of the relationship is communicated entirely through action, through grief, and through the structural weight the poem gives to Patroclus's death. Achilles, the greatest warrior at Troy, has withdrawn from the fighting over a wounded sense of honor, and the Greek forces are being routed without him. Generals, kings, even the gods try to coax him back into battle, and nothing works. His pride is the immovable center of the poem. Then Patroclus puts on Achilles' own armor and enters the fighting in his place, and is killed by the Trojan prince Hector. Only then does Achilles return to battle, not for glory, not for the Greek cause, but purely to kill the man who killed Patroclus. His grief in the poem is described with a rawness that has no real parallel elsewhere in the text. He pours dust over his own head. He tears at his hair. The women serving in his tent weep alongside him, but Homer notes pointedly that they weep for Patroclus, while Achilles is mourning something else entirely, something the poem doesn't fully name but doesn't need to. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, rises from the ocean because she hears him screaming from below the waves. He tells her he no longer wants to live. He says he would rather die avenging Patroclus than go on living without him. He refuses to let the body be buried, unable to accept the finality of the loss, until the gods themselves eventually intervene. Ancient readers didn't treat this relationship as ambiguous. In Plato's Symposium, characters discuss Achilles and Patroclus explicitly as lovers, debating only which of the two occupied which role. A debate that itself shows how naturally the pairing mapped onto the Greek framework for understanding love between men. The playwright Aeschylus reportedly wrote a now-lost tragedy in which the two were depicted as lovers outright, and centuries later, Alexander the Great, who modeled himself deliberately on Achilles, is said to have wept at what was believed to be Achilles' tomb, and called him fortunate for having had a Patroclus to mourn him, a comment that suggests Alexander understood the relationship exactly the way most of the ancient world did. This matters beyond literary curiosity because the Iliad was never a marginal text in Greek culture. It was the foundational one. Every educated Greek knew it. Boys memorized long stretches of it. It was quoted constantly in philosophical argument and political oratory, and it defined Greek ideals of heroism, honor, and human excellence more than any other single work. The love between Achilles and Patroclus wasn't a footnote in that text. It was the emotional engine driving the entire second half of the poem. The single most important story the Greeks told about their own heroic past was structured around love between men as its most powerful emotional force. If you wanted a single historical example of just how seriously the ancient Greek world took love between men, you could do worse than start with one of the greatest military commanders in human history. A man who carved out an empire stretching from Greece to the edges of India before he turned 30. And note that he appears to have organized a significant portion of his emotional life around one particular companion. Alexander the Great and Hephaestion were inseparable from childhood. They were educated together under Aristotle. They campaigned side by side for over a decade. And when Hephaestion died suddenly of fever in 324 BCE, Alexander's grief was severe enough to genuinely alarm his own generals. Alexander and Hephaestion grew up together at the Macedonian court, part of the small cohort of elite boys tutored together by Aristotle at Myeza. Arguably, one of the most consequential classrooms in history, given what several of its students went on to accomplish by the time Alexander launched his Persian campaign in 334 BCE. Hephaestion was serving as his second in command, his closest confidant, and by most ancient accounts, the person whose judgment Alexander trusted above anyone else's. He was given serious military commands, sensitive diplomatic missions, and significant administrative authority. But his most important role, by every indication, was simply being the one person Alexander relied on completely and could not imagine functioning without. Ancient writers are not coy about the nature of this relationship. Several describe the two explicitly as lovers. When Alexander's army reached Troy early in the campaign, a stop he insisted on, given how deeply invested he was in modeling himself on Achilles. He laid a wreath at the tomb, traditionally identified as Achilles's. Hephaestion, in a gesture that was clearly deliberate and clearly public, laid a wreath at the tomb attributed to Patroclus. The parallel was unmistakable and fully intentional. Alexander was positioning the two of them, consciously and in full view of his army, within the literary tradition of the great male bond at the heart of the Iliad. The relationship shaped the campaign in tangible ways. Hephaestion's loyalty to Alexander appears in the ancient sources as essentially absolute. Other Macedonian generals are recorded clashing with Alexander over strategy and policy. Hephaestion is consistently described as someone who subordinated his own judgment entirely to Alexander's purposes. Alexander entrusted him with information and authority he gave to no one else in his inner circle. In one frequently retold episode, the captured Persian queen Mother Sisygambis, meeting the two men for the first time, mistakenly addressed Hephaestion rather than Alexander. Hephaestion, as it happened, was taller and more physically imposing. Alexander's response is telling. He told her she had made no error at all, because he too is Alexander. When Hephaestion died at Ecbatana in 324 BCE, apparently from fever, complicated by heavy drinking during his illness, Alexander's reaction was extreme by any measure. He reportedly refused food for days. He lay across the body. He had the attending physician executed for failing to save Hephaestion's life. He ordered the manes and tails of the army's horses shorn as a sign of mourning. He had the battlements of a nearby city torn down as a further gesture of grief, not the act of a man in ordinary mourning, but of someone who needed to break something on a scale matching his loss. He sent envoys to the oracle at Siwa to ask whether Hephaestion could be honored as a god. He himself survived Hephaestion by less than a year, dying in Babylon in 323 BCE. Whether that death was connected to his grief in some way, whether it accelerated his drinking, or simply took something essential out of him, is impossible to know for certain. What the ancient sources do agree on is that from Hephaestion's death onward, something in Alexander was visibly diminished in a way that unsettled the men closest to him. Let's come down from philosophy and military history for a moment and ask a more grounded question. What did ordinary daily life actually look like? If you walked through the Athenian agora on any given morning in the 5th century BCE, what would you actually have seen? Who walked with whom? What did public affection look like in practice? Did the philosophical openness we've been discussing all evening show up in how ordinary people actually behaved in public? Or was it confined to elite dinner parties and philosophical texts? The agora was the beating heart of Athenian public life. A large open space ringed by administrative buildings, temples, covered colonnades, and market stalls, through which the entire citizen population passed on any given day. It was where you bought fish, olive oil, and pottery. It was where legal disputes were argued and civic announcements made. It was where philosophers walked with their students, and where Socrates famously spent much of his time, stopping strangers to ask them to define justice or courage, until they either engaged seriously or walked away in frustration. What moved through this space, in its formal public business function, was overwhelmingly men. Citizen women appeared in public for specific, limited purposes: religious processions, trips to draw water or shop, funerals. But the agora, in its full civic capacity, was male territory. And within that male space, the entire spectrum of relationships between men was visible and unremarkable. Men walked close together, arms around shoulders, hands resting casually on each other. The ordinary physical ease of people, genuinely comfortable in each other's company. Pairs known within their social circle as Erasts and Ereminos were recognized as such openly, without concealment. Athenian comedy, which survives in real quantity through the plays of Aristophanes, offers a somewhat less reverent street-level view. Aristophanes mocks men perceived as effeminate, men accused of trading their dignity for money or political advancement, and the gap between the philosopher's idealized rhetoric of noble love and the messier reality of desire and ambition playing out in actual Athenian politics. These jokes are sometimes cited as proof that Greek attitudes weren't universally comfortable with every form of male same-sex conduct. And that's accurate. Comedy targets social friction wherever it exists, and these jokes reveal genuine hierarchies and real social penalties operating beneath the philosophical celebration we've spent the evening describing. What the comedy doesn't show is anything resembling blanket condemnation of desire between men as such. The jokes target specific behaviors, being too obvious, too eager, too willing to trade dignity for advantage, not the underlying existence of love between men. You could be mocked for excessive enthusiasm or a lack of restraint. You were not, in mainstream Athenian culture, mocked simply for loving another man. Public courtship displays of a particular, recognized kind were common enough to attract no special notice. The older admirer bringing gifts, attending the gymnasium to watch a young man train, escorting him to social gatherings. These were public performances everyone in the relevant social circle understood and recognized instantly. The younger partner was expected to remain somewhat reserved, accepting the attention gracefully without appearing overly eager, requiring the older man to prove his sincerity over time. This entire choreography played out in the open, in shared public spaces, not behind closed doors. The ancient Greeks were, to a degree that still catches modern audiences off guard, deeply preoccupied with the physical beauty of the human body, particularly the male body. The gymnasium wasn't merely a place to exercise. It functioned as a genuine social institution, a philosophical meeting place, and a space of open display and evaluation, sitting squarely at the intersection of physical culture, education, and desire. Men trained naked. The word gymnasium derives directly from the Greek word for nakedness, and this was treated as entirely ordinary, aesthetically valuable, and nothing to feel self-conscious about. The trained, beautiful body was, in a real sense, considered a public good. Picture arriving at the gymnasium in the late morning, its busiest hour. A large central courtyard ringed by a running track, areas set aside for wrestling and discus and javelin, and shaded colonnades where men strolled and talked through the heat of the day. The air carries the smell of olive oil, dust, and physical effort. Athletes rubbed oil onto bare skin before exercising, both to protect it, and because oiled skin was simply considered more beautiful to look at. And the Greeks felt no need to pretend otherwise. Afterward, they scraped the mixture of oil, dust, and sweat away with a curved metal tool called a strigil, a process depicted often enough in Greek sculpture to suggest it was considered worthy of artistic attention in its own right. The philosophical stakes attached to physical beauty ran deep in Greek thought. Beauty was never considered merely a pleasant surface quality. It was believed to carry genuine moral significance. The compound term kalos kagathos, roughly beautiful and good, fused physical and ethical excellence into a single concept, reflecting a real cultural conviction that outward beauty and inward virtue were connected, that a beautiful body pointed toward a beautiful soul. This belief was easily complicated by obvious counterexamples. Socrates, widely regarded as the wisest man in Athens, was famously unattractive, but it persisted as a genuine cultural assumption nonetheless. For a young man training at the gymnasium, being admired wasn't uncomfortable. Within limits, it was expected and welcomed. The gymnasium functioned, in part, as an informal marketplace of reputation, where a young man's presence and appearance became public information for older men looking for someone to mentor and attach themselves to. The familiar conventions of courtship played out here just as naturally as anywhere else. An older man might watch a promising youth train, find an occasion to speak with him, and begin the longer, more patient process of proving himself worthy as a mentor and companion. Greek sculpture emerged directly out of this gymnasium culture. The standing male kouros figures of the archaic period, with their careful anatomical detail and faint, enigmatic smiles, were the product of a society that had spent generations studying naked male bodies in motion and developing exacting standards for what ideal proportion and movement looked like. The classical nude, the idealized male form that would go on to become one of the most persistent subjects in Western art, wasn't an abstract artistic convention invented in a vacuum. It was grounded in the lived, specific experience of men who had spent their lives in gymnasia, watching, admiring, and forming precise opinions about the human form. The gymnasium doubled, quite literally, as a center of philosophical life. Plato's Academy, the school he founded around 387 BCE, which gave the English language the word academic, stood in a grove near a gymnasium on the outskirts of Athens. The Cynosarges Gymnasium was associated with Antisthenes, founder of the Cynic school of philosophy, and the Lyceum Gymnasium was where Aristotle taught, giving his followers their nickname, the Peripatetics, the Walkers, because because he and his students apparently found they thought best while moving. Philosophy, quite literally, happened in gymnasia. Body and mind occupied the same physical space, and the Greeks saw nothing at all contradictory in that arrangement. One of the reasons ancient Greek attitudes toward same-sex desire are so unusually well documented is that the Greeks depicted it constantly, explicitly, and without any apparent anxiety in their visual art, especially on pottery. The red figure and black figure vases that survive today in museum collections around the world show scenes of courtship between men. Scenes from the Symposium, mythological episodes involving divine same-sex desire, and a genuinely large body of visual material that makes it hard to argue this was ever treated as a marginal or shameful subject. These images weren't confined to some special category of fine art. They were painted on everyday household objects, used at ordinary dinner parties. Greek painted pottery was first and foremost functional. These were the actual vessels people used to mix wine and water, to store oil and grain, to pour offerings at religious ceremonies. When a painter decorated a wine-mixing vessel with a scene of an older man courting a younger one, that vessel then went into ordinary domestic use. It sat on a shelf. It got passed around at a symposium. Nobody hid it away. The imagery was considered unremarkable enough to display on an object you'd casually use in front of your dinner guests. The conventions governing these courtship scenes are well documented by art historians and follow recognizable, repeated patterns. A bearded older man, wrapped in a hamadrian, reaches toward a younger man in a gesture scholars call the up and down, one hand toward the chin, one toward the groin, indicating a respectful courtship approach rather than anything crude. The younger figure is typically shown as somewhat reserved, neither eagerly welcoming nor outright refusing. Gifts often appear in these scenes: a hare, a rooster, a branch, being offered as tokens. In a handful of painted figures, the entire choreography of Greek courtship gets compressed into a single image: the pursuit, the dignity expected of that pursuit, gifts as proof of serious intent. These scenes appear right alongside perfectly ordinary depictions of athletic competition, mythological episodes, symposium gatherings, and religious ritual. You could pick up an Athenian drinking cup and find a scene from the Trojan War on one side and a courtship scene between two men on the other, and this would have registered as an entirely unremarkable decorative choice. Both subjects belonged to the same visual world, judged by the same aesthetic standards, carrying the same cultural weight. The survival of this material into the modern era has had its own complicated afterlife. A significant number of the more explicit pieces spent much of the 19th and early 20th centuries locked away in restricted rooms, sometimes called a secret cabinet, accessible only to credentialed scholars presumed sturdy enough to handle the material. The British Museum kept one. The National Archaeological Museum in Naples famously sealed off its collection of ancient erotic material for decades, only opening the room to the general public in the 1980s. The objects themselves never changed. What changed across those intervening centuries was who was permitted to decide the material was appropriate to view. What this really tells us isn't primarily about the ancient Greeks. It's about how uncomfortable much later eras became with material the Greeks themselves had been perfectly happy to put on their everyday dinnerware. Modern museum visitors encountering these pieces today, properly contextualized, tend to react with considerably less alarm than Victorian curators once did. The Greeks, looking at their own pottery, were presumably not alarmed at all. It would be a mistake, though, to conclude from all this that Greek society had no rules whatsoever governing desire and sexual conduct. It had quite specific ones. They were simply organized around entirely different principles than the ones modern societies use. The key dividing lines were not the genders of the people involved, but the social roles they occupied, questions of age, of citizen versus non-citizen status, of active versus passive role, of voluntary participation versus coercion. These were the distinctions that actually mattered in Greek moral thinking about desire. Certain behaviors were celebrated. Others were sharply stigmatized, and the line between them ran through places a modern reader wouldn't necessarily expect. The single most fundamental distinction was between the active and passive roles in a sexual relationship, and this distinction mapped directly onto the broader social hierarchy. In Greek thought, the active, penetrating role was associated with masculinity, authority, and civic dignity. The passive role was associated with subordination and a kind of diminished civic standing. For an adult male citizen to voluntarily occupy the passive role was considered genuinely shameful, not because it involved desire for another man, but because it represented the wrong relationship to power and status. It was this asymmetry of power and status, not the sex of the people involved, that organized Greek moral judgment on the matter. This meant the exact same physical act could be entirely acceptable in one social configuration and heavily stigmatized in another. A citizen man taking the active role with an enslaved person, a foreigner, or anyone of lower status was considered entirely unremarkable. A citizen man voluntarily taking the passive role with anyone at all was a serious matter of social contempt, and in some cases carried genuine legal consequences. Athens had a specific law, attested by multiple ancient sources, called atimia, civic dishonor, which could strip a citizen of the right to speak in the assembly, hold public office, or otherwise participate in civic life. It applied to a man judged to have prostituted himself, understood specifically as taking the passive role in exchange for money. Crucially, the law was never about the sex of a man's partners. It was about protecting the presumed dignity of the citizen body as a whole. This distinction shows up clearly in one of the most famous surviving legal cases from ancient Athens, the prosecution of a man named Timarchus in 346 BCE, recorded in a speech by the orator Aeschines that survives essentially intact. Aeschines was prosecuting Timarchus, a political ally of his rival Demosthenes, on a charge of heterses, roughly, having sold himself as a companion or prostituted himself. The accusation was never that Timarchus had desired men or had relationships with them. The charge was that, as a young man, he had allowed wealthy older men to keep him in exchange for money and material support, that he had sold the passive role for payment, and in doing so had surrendered the dignity expected of a free Athenian citizen. The Atimia law under which Timarchus was tried was quite specific about what it actually prohibited. It was not a blanket prohibition on desire or sexual conduct between men. It targeted Athenian citizens who prostituted themselves, defined narrowly as taking the passive role in direct exchange for payment. The line the law drew was between a relationship conducted through the recognized conventions of courtship, pursuit, gifts, a slow demonstration of sincere commitment, and eventual yielding out of genuine affection, and a straightforward commercial transaction in which money purchased sexual access, and in doing so, degraded the person who accepted it to the status of someone who had sold away his own civic dignity. Aeschines won his case. Timarchus was convicted and stripped of his civic rights, permanently barred from speaking in the assembly or holding public office. The verdict was as much a political blow against Demosthenes as it was a personal catastrophe for Timarchus himself. But what makes the case so useful for understanding Greek attitudes is what Aeschines takes pains to say elsewhere in the very same speech. He explicitly distinguishes the dishonorable conduct he's prosecuting from the honorable tradition of love between men, going so far as to cite Achilles and Patroclus approvingly as proof that such love, conducted properly, was noble, ancient, and entirely beside the point of his prosecution. He was never attacking love between men as a category. He was attacking one very specific violation of civic dignity. Within a framework, everyone in that Athenian courtroom understood perfectly well. Beyond formal law, mockery served as the other major enforcement mechanism, operating below the level of the courts. Athenian comedy was relentless toward men perceived to have violated the expected distribution of roles. Men mocked as effeminate, men seen as too obviously eager to please powerful patrons, men whose past as a passive partner in youth was known or merely rumored. Public ridicule served a genuine social function here, reinforcing norms even in the absence of formal legal proceedings. You might never end up prosecuted, but a sufficiently skilled comic playwright with the right material could render you socially useless for years. And in a culture where public reputation functioned as the primary currency of civic life, that was a serious and lasting penalty. The overall picture that emerges is of a society with real rules, genuinely enforced, built around specific and consistent principles, not the gender of one's desire, but the social role and dignity of the citizen involved. Within those rules, love between men was celebrated, philosophized about at length, depicted constantly in art, and built directly into military and civic institutions. Outside those rules, specific violations were punished by law, by ridicule, or by social exclusion. The line sat in a very different place than a modern reader might expect. But it was a real line, and everyone within that society understood exactly where it fell. Let's return one more time to Plato's Symposium, because one particular speech from that evening deserves its own full discussion. The comic playwright Aristophanes, yes, a writer best known for jokes about flatulence and corrupt politicians, is handed one of the most genuinely moving passages in the entire history of Western philosophy. A creation myth explaining, in essence, the origin of romantic longing itself. According to Aristophanes' telling, human beings did not originally look the way they do now. In the beginning, people were round, with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces set back to back on a single head. They came in 3 original varieties. Some were double male, some were double female, and some combined one of each. These original humans were extraordinarily strong and extraordinarily proud. Proud enough, in fact, that they began plotting to storm Mount Olympus and challenge the gods directly. Zeus faced a genuine dilemma. Destroying these creatures outright would cost the gods the worship and sacrifices humanity provided. But leaving them at full strength was clearly too dangerous. His solution was to cut each one cleanly in half, separating the 2 faces, and having Apollo pull the skin around to the front and gather it at what we now call the navel, leaving each person a permanent, visible reminder of the wound and of what had been severed from them. The result, in Aristophanes' account, is the entire foundation of human romantic and erotic longing. Every person alive is, in some sense, only half of an original whole, wandering the earth in search of the specific other half they were separated from, those descended from an original double female, being seek-out women. Aristophanes notes, adding with a comedian's characteristic mischief, that this tends to produce women who are independent-minded and not especially interested in men. Those descended from a double male original seek out other men. And here Aristophanes turns unexpectedly earnest. These men, he says, tend to be among the finest people in society, the most courageous, the most capable in public life, because they are fragments of what had once been the strongest of all the original beings. Their desire for other men, he insists, doesn't come from mere physical appetite, but from something considerably deeper, a genuine recognition of a kindred soul, a longing that is fundamentally about connection rather than simple gratification. It's a striking move within the dialogue. In a speech that treats all 3 original types with real seriousness, Aristophanes singles out the male-male pairing as, in some sense, the finest of the three, the source of the most capable leaders, the most courageous citizens. He isn't merely flattering the men gathered in the room that evening. He's constructing a genuine philosophical argument that desire between men, when it grows out of authentic recognition between kindred souls, represents one of the highest expressions of what Eros is capable of producing in a human life. The speech ends with an image of reunion, the moment when a separated half finally finds its matching other half, and both are overwhelmed by a feeling that this isn't a new beginning at all, but a return to something they had always, somehow, already known. Aristophanes offers this as a literal mythological explanation. These are quite simply two halves of a single original being, recognizing each other across the years and the distance, and becoming whole again. It's easy to see why this image has endured for 2,500 years. It describes something recognizable to nearly anyone who has ever fallen seriously in love. That particular, uncanny sense that you have somehow always known this person, even on the first day you met them. If ancient Greece produced one single relationship that seems to gather up all the philosophical, erotic, and deeply human complexity of the culture into one story, it might well be the strange, tangled bond between Socrates and Alcibiades. Socrates, by every ancient account, was strikingly ugly, a snub nose, bulging eyes, a build nobody described as impressive. Alcibiades was one of the most beautiful, most charismatic, and ultimately most politically destructive men in Athens. The two were drawn to each other by a force neither of them seemed fully able to explain, and their dynamic inverted almost every convention Greek courtship normally followed. Alcibiades appears throughout the historical record as one of the most brilliant and most catastrophically destabilizing Athenians of his generation. A genuinely talented military commander, a political figure of extraordinary charm, and a man whose personal ambition and instability contributed directly to some of Athens's worst strategic disasters. He had been beautiful since childhood, pursued by older admirers in the conventional pattern we've already described, and by all accounts accustomed to getting whatever he wanted through a combination of looks, sharp intelligence, and sheer force of personality. Then he encountered Socrates, and everything he thought he understood about how desire and pursuit were supposed to work simply stopped functioning as expected. In the Symposium, Alcibiades delivers a long, wine-soaked speech about Socrates that stands as one of the most candid accounts of frustrated, one-sided longing to survive from ancient literature. He describes himself pursuing Socrates rather than the other way around, a complete reversal of the roles he was accustomed to, because Socrates' steady focus on his soul, rather than his physical beauty, had forced Alcibiades, against his own will, to recognize that Socrates possessed something genuinely more valuable than anything his own beauty had ever won him. He describes dismissing his attendants one night and lying under Socrates' cloak, waiting, only for Socrates to sleep through the entire encounter, untouched, and wake the next morning with what Alcibiades could only interpret as complete indifference to a body everyone else in Athens found irresistible. Alcibiades is visibly furious about this in his speech, the particular fury of a beautiful person discovering, for once, that beauty doesn't work the way it always has. But he is just as visibly devoted. The speech overflows with exasperation, but also with something that sounds an awful lot like genuine love, or at least the most intense admiration-exasperation is capable of producing. He compares Socrates to the carved figurines of Silenus, sold in the marketplace, grotesque and comic on the outside, but opening up to reveal golden statues of the gods hidden within. He confesses that Socrates is the only person who has ever made him feel ashamed of how he's living his own life. He says, in essence, that he cannot bear to live around Socrates and cannot bear to live without him. Precisely the kind of contradictory thing people say when they are in love and don't entirely want to admit it, even to themselves. Socrates, for his part, never stopped being genuinely invested in Alcibiades. Elsewhere in Plato's dialogues, he's shown seeking the young man out, worrying over him in the specific way you worry about someone whose potential you can see clearly, and whose choices you can already tell are going to squander it. His repeated refusal of Alcibiades' physical advances wasn't indifference. It was Socratic teaching at its most demanding. He was insisting that what Alcibiades actually needed, and what Socrates was uniquely positioned to offer him, wasn't physical intimacy at all, but the far harder gift of being genuinely known, genuinely challenged, and refused easy flattery. The relationship ended badly, as most things involving Alcibiades eventually did. He made a series of catastrophic political decisions, defected to Sparta at a critical juncture of the Peloponnesian War, later returned to Athens, fled again, and was eventually assassinated in exile. Socrates himself was tried and executed in 399 BCE on charges of corrupting the youth of Athens. And among the young men whose ruin the prosecution implicitly pointed to, Alcibiades was almost certainly the most obvious example anyone in the jury could have named. There's a real irony buried in that ending. The philosopher who had spent decades trying to help Alcibiades become his best possible self was, in the end, partly blamed for the very disasters that Alcibiades produced. Disasters that no one, including Socrates, had managed to prevent. Thebes rarely gets the credit it deserves in the popular imagination of ancient Greece. Athens dominates the philosophical story. Sparta dominates the military one. And Thebes tends to get mentioned mainly as the city that produced the Sacred Band and briefly, brilliantly dominated Greek politics in the 4th century BCE. before Alexander's rise brought the conversation to an abrupt close. But Theban aristocratic culture had developed its own sophisticated understanding of male bonds, political, military, and romantic, as overlapping categories, each strengthening the others rather than competing with them. To understand Thebes properly, you have to understand what it meant to be a secondary power caught between two giants who despised each other. Athens and Sparta spent much of the 5th century BCE locked in various states of cold and hot conflict, eventually dragging the entire Greek world into the catastrophic Peloponnesian War. Thebes sat wedged between them, sometimes allied with Sparta, sometimes opposed, always aware that its survival depended on reading the larger political situation correctly and positioning itself with precision. This produced a particular kind of political sharpness, the sharpness of people who know they cannot simply overpower their rivals through brute strength, and must therefore be cleverer, more unified, and more strategically exact than anyone around them. Theban aristocratic culture treated the bond between men as a political instrument in the most direct and practical sense. Relationships between elite Theban men, shaped by shared upbringing, shared military training, and in many cases, the explicit bond of love between an older and younger partner, were understood as the social glue holding the governing class together. Men who had grown up together, trained together, and loved each other, the reasoning went, made political decisions that were more reliable, more deeply committed, and harder to corrupt than decisions made among men whose ties to each other were merely transactional. The Theban general Pelopidas, who commanded the sacred band during its greatest victories, embodied this philosophy in his own life. His relationship with the statesman and general Epaminondas, the brilliant tactical mind who redesigned the Greek battle line and broke Spartan dominance at Leuctra, was one of the most celebrated partnerships in the ancient world. Ancient sources describe the two as inseparable from youth, devoted to each other across decades of shared political and military effort. Whether their bond carried an explicitly erotic dimension, as some ancient sources hint, or is better understood as the deepest form of Greek philia, is a question the surviving record simply doesn't resolve cleanly. And it's worth noting that the Greeks themselves likely wouldn't have found the distinction nearly as important as a modern reader instinctively does. What Thebes achieved during the generation of Pelopidas and Epaminondas was a brief, extraordinary run of political and military dominance, built consciously on the belief that bonds of love between men made those men harder to defeat in battle. Epaminondas redesigned the traditional Greek battle line by massing his very best troops into an unusually deep column on one flank, rather than spreading strength evenly across the entire front. At Leuctra in 371 BCE, this oblique attack shattered the Spartan right wing before the rest of the battle had even fully developed, and Sparta never fully recovered its former dominance. The Sacred Band, fighting at the spearhead of that assault, performed exactly as the underlying theory predicted it would. Theban supremacy lasted, in the end, only about a generation. Epaminondas was killed at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE. A battle Thebes technically won, but at the cost of the one general whose leadership had made its victories possible. Without him, the political and military cohesion that his partnership with Pelopidas and the broader culture surrounding the Sacred Band had sustained began quietly to unravel. By the time Philip of Macedon arrived with his newly reorganized army and his teenage son at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Thebes was a considerably diminished power. The Sacred Band died where it stood, and Thebes's brief experiment in building a regional empire on a foundation of love between men came to an end on a battlefield in Boeotia. 300 bodies left lying in formation, unbroken to the very last moment. The symposium officially opened with dinner and continued into wine and conversation. But the many surviving ancient sources make it fairly clear the evening didn't always end there, at the level of philosophical debate. The boundary between intellectual companionship, artistic performance, and physical intimacy was blurred by design at these gatherings. Flute girls and cupbearers moved continuously through the room. Wine, always mixed with water, but always flowing, gradually loosened inhibitions. What followed later in the evening was not, by Greek standards, a departure from the intellectual purpose of the gathering. It was understood as its natural continuation. A symposium followed a recognizable arc across the course of an evening. The early hours were reserved for serious business. Formal speeches, philosophical games, recited poetry, careful demonstrations of wit that established a man's standing among his peers. As the night wore on and the wine kept circulating, the formalities gradually relaxed. Men who had spent the early evening performing for one another began, instead, simply being with one another. A subtly different thing, and often a far more revealing one. Physical setting itself encouraged a closeness that daytime public life never allowed. Men reclined on shared couches, close enough to speak quietly, close enough to touch without drawing particular attention. Oil lamps threw warm, limited pools of light, leaving most of the room in shadow. Music from the flute girl continued without pause, filling silences that might otherwise have grown awkward, generating a kind of ambient permission for whatever else was unfolding in the room. None of this was accidental. The symposium was a carefully engineered social technology built to produce a very specific kind of intimacy. And the Greeks understood precisely what they were constructing when they built it. What actually happened once the formal portion of the evening concluded is described with varying degrees of directness across the surviving sources. Comedy tends to be the most unfiltered witness here. Aristophanes' plays contain jokes that leave little doubt about what some symposia turned into as the night wore on and the wine ran low. Philosophical texts are more restrained, but not not entirely silent on the matter. Plato's Symposium itself ends with most of the guests either asleep or gone home, and Socrates still awake, still talking, apparently unaffected by either the wine or the late hour. A detail ancient readers would have understood as yet another demonstration of his famous self-discipline. The cupbearer, the young attendant who poured the wine and moved through the room all evening, occupied a role everyone present understood as both entirely practical and quietly charged. In households wealthy enough to employ attractive attendants, the cupbearer was often selected partly for his looks, and his presence throughout the evening carried a kind of ambient eroticism that required no explicit acknowledgement. He wasn't there to debate philosophy. He was there to pour wine and to look good doing it. And both functions were treated as legitimate contributions to a successful evening. What the Symposium built over time was a culture in which intellectual life and erotic life were understood as genuinely continuous with one another, rather than separate spheres. A man who desired a beautiful younger companion was expected to pursue that desire through conversation, through shared philosophical inquiry, through the patient, unhurried work of proving his interest extended to the whole person and not merely the body. And only then, perhaps, through physical intimacy, desire was the starting point. What it eventually became depended entirely on the character of the people involved. That, at least, was the Greek ideal. The Greek reality, as comedy documents with obvious relish, was considerably messier in practice. Lesbos, in the archaic period, stood among the genuine cultural centers of the Greek world, wealthy, cosmopolitan, connected by trade to the wider Mediterranean, and the kind of place where poetry was treated as a serious social and spiritual practice rather than mere entertainment. Sappho was born into this world, and it was into this same world that she released poetry describing the physical texture of female desire with a specificity that has essentially no real parallel anywhere else in the surviving ancient record. She wrote about the sudden heat rising through the body, the difficulty of drawing breath, the way an entire room seems to rearrange itself around one particular person. Lesbos sits in the northeastern Aegean, close to the coast of what is now Turkey, and in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, it was genuinely prosperous. A trading island with connections reaching east toward the great cities of the Near East and west toward mainland Greece and beyond. Mytilene, the city where Sappho lived, was politically active and culturally ambitious, the kind of place that produced poets and philosophers alongside merchants and sailors. By most accounts, it was also a place where educated women had somewhat more visible public and social lives than their counterparts in Athens. More likely to attend public gatherings, more likely to take part in the community's religious and cultural life. Sappho's poems were performed, and this detail is worth dwelling on because it's easy to overlook when treating her purely as a literary figure on the page. ancient Greek lyric poetry wasn't read silently by isolated individuals. It was sung, accompanied by a lyre, in social settings, in front of audiences who often knew both the poet and the people she was singing about. When Sappho wrote about a particular woman, a companion, a specific named figure, or the unnamed woman whose laughter, in her most famous surviving fragment, leaves Sappho physically undone. She was singing about real people, in front of real audiences, in a community where those individuals were known to everyone listening. This makes her poetry something closer to a public declaration than a private diary. Performed desire, shared openly with a community that apparently received it as an entirely normal part of artistic and social life. She wasn't confessing in secret. She was composing and performing at the very highest level her culture recognized, poems whose subject happened to be her own desire for women, the ancient world's enduring celebration of her as one of the greatest lyric poets who ever lived strongly suggests that this subject matter was never treated as a disqualification from artistic greatness, that her poems were judged on their poetic merit, and that their poetic merit was considered extraordinary, full stop. What we can reconstruct of the community that gathered around Sappho, whatever exactly it was, suggests a circle of young women in which education, music, poetry, religious observance, and deep personal attachment coexisted simultaneously. Girls appear to have come to her from families across Lesbos, and possibly from further afield, to learn music, poetry, and the social graces that would later serve them in marriage and adult life. They eventually left to marry, and Sappho wrote wedding songs for them, tender pieces that are sometimes tinged with a particular sorrow, the sorrow of someone who understands the person departing is heading somewhere she herself cannot follow. Her poems of loss and longing for specific named companions who have gone away carry the specific emotional weight of someone writing about real, particular people who are genuinely missed. This isn't metaphor. It's a woman with a lyre, a community, and a series of attachments that ended the way such attachments in that world inevitably did. Girls growing up, marrying away, disappearing into other households and other cities. Sappho was left with her poems. We are left with fragments of those poems, and within those fragments, the desire remains as specific and as undeniable as anything else that survives from the ancient world. For several centuries, ancient Greek culture, including its attitudes toward desire between men, existed in something close to its own self-contained world. Then Rome arrived, absorbed Greek civilization with tremendous enthusiasm, and brought with it a set of complications that meaningfully reshaped the picture. Roman attitudes toward male same-sex desire were never a simple continuation of the Greek model. Rome borrowed certain pieces of it, reframed others, and layered on its own distinct concerns about class, status, and legal restriction. The arrival of Roman dominance over the Greek world marks the beginning of a long, gradual shift in how these questions were understood and discussed. Rome's absorption of Greece was gradual military, then political, then thoroughly cultural. In a process the Roman poet Horace later described with characteristic irony as captive Greece capturing her captor. Roman elites became genuinely obsessed with Greek culture. They learned Greek, studied Greek philosophy, filled their homes with Greek sculpture, and sent their sons to Athens and Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy. The gymnasium became fashionable among wealthy Romans, a trend that alarmed conservative figures like Cato the Elder considerably. Greek intellectual life flooded into Rome, viewed by some as genuine cultural enrichment, and by others as a serious moral hazard. Roman culture developed its own framework for thinking about male same-sex desire, and it shared the Greek emphasis on active versus passive roles, rather than organizing itself around the sex of the partners involved. Roman law and social convention were broadly comfortable with a citizen man taking the active role with partners of lower status, enslaved people, freedmen, foreigners, regardless of their sex. What was stigmatized, just as in Greece, was an adult male citizen occupying the passive role. This was termed stuprum, and it was considered a serious violation of the dignity expected of a Roman citizen. The concern, again, was never really about the sex of one's partners. It was about the underlying distribution of power. Where Rome diverged from Greece most sharply was in its treatment of the pederastic institution that Greek culture had formalized, and in many respects openly celebrated. Roman law eventually developed protections associated with a measure known as the lex scantinia, whose exact provisions remain debated among historians, but which appears to have restricted sexual relations with freeborn Roman boys. This represented a meaningful break from the Greek framework, in which the formal courtship of elite youths by older men had been publicly celebrated as a pillar of education and social formation. Rome, at least officially, was considerably less comfortable with this, and its law reflected a differently drawn boundary between acceptable and unacceptable conduct. The private lives of Roman emperors add further texture to this picture. Julius Caesar was mocked by his political rivals with accusations that, as a young man, he had taken the passive role with the king of Bithynia, an accusation clearly designed to damage his political dignity, and one that reportedly continued to irritate Caesar for the rest of his life. The Emperor Hadrian's devotion to a young Bithynian named Antinous, who drowned in the Nile in 130 CE, was one of the most publicly visible same-sex attachments of the entire ancient world. After Antinous' death, Hadrian had him formally deified, commissioned temples to him across the empire, and founded a city bearing his name. Hadrian made no attempt whatsoever to conceal either his grief or his devotion, and the Roman world's response ranged from genuine sympathy to quiet skepticism. But But nobody seriously suggested the emperor's position was threatened by any of it. Christianity's arrival into this already complicated Roman world fundamentally changed the terms of the conversation. It introduced a framework in which certain forms of desire were understood not merely as undignified or socially disruptive, but as genuinely sinful, offensive before God, and requiring active suppression rather than the careful social governance the Greeks and Romans had practiced. That shift unfolded gradually over centuries, but it was already well underway by the time the Western Roman Empire began to fracture. By the early medieval period, the casual, unembarrassed integration of same-sex desire into Greek philosophy, mythology, and daily social life had become something later writers felt they needed to explain away, apologize for, or simply misread. Sometime around the 1st or 2nd century CE, the Greek biographer and essayist Plutarch composed a dialogue titled the Erotikos, sometimes rendered as dialogue on love, in which various characters debate, at length, and with genuine feeling, the relative merits of love for women versus love for men. What makes the dialogue remarkable isn't that it reaches a tidy conclusion. It doesn't, really. What's remarkable is that this exact debate was still being conducted in sophisticated literary form, centuries after the classical period had ended, suggesting the questions ancient Greece had first opened had never really been closed. Plutarch himself was a serious, deeply humane writer, best known for his parallel lives, pairing notable Greek and Roman historical figures against one another. Still among the most readable works to survive from antiquity. He also served as a priest of Apollo at Delphi, a man of genuine personal piety and fairly conventional views on marriage and family life. His engagement with the question of love between men, accordingly, wasn't that of an enthusiastic celebrant, but of someone genuinely wrestling with competing claims. Someone who respected the older tradition and understood its philosophical weight, while holding his own convictions about where the highest forms of love were actually to be found. The Erotikos is framed around a real or plausibly real social dispute, whether a wealthy widow should be permitted to pursue marriage with a young man already promised by his family to someone else. Various characters take sides, and the argument naturally expands outward from this specific case into the much larger question of which kinds of love are genuine, valuable, and philosophically defensible. One speaker argues passionately for the superiority of love between men, its philosophical depth, its connection to virtue, its freedom from the purely physical entanglements of love between men and women. Another argues, with equal passion, for the naturalness and dignity of love between men and women, grounding it in the divine purpose behind human reproduction, and in the genuine partnership marriage makes possible. What stands out is the seriousness Plutarch grants to both positions. Neither side is dismissed outright. Neither is treated as obviously mistaken. The dialogue form Plato had perfected centuries earlier was built precisely for this kind of genuine, unresolved tension, for holding two compelling arguments side by side without forcing a premature resolution. Plutarch uses that same form here to document a simple fact: that educated Greek-speaking people in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE were still conducting essentially the same argument Plato's characters had been having 500 years before them. The Eretikos also contains some of Plutarch's most genuinely beautiful writing on marriage. Elsewhere in his work, he expressed real conviction that marriage between a man and a woman could constitute a profound philosophical partnership, a relationship of mutual growth and deepening understanding capable of rivaling anything the Symposium tradition had ever celebrated. His advice to a bride and groom treats marriage with a seriousness and warmth that wasn't universal in the ancient world. He wasn't arguing against love between men out of contempt for it. He was arguing honestly and in good faith for something else he genuinely valued. The debate Plutarch documented was never fully resolved because the ancient world itself came to an end before the question could be settled, replaced by a new framework, organized around entirely different premises that eventually declared certain forms of desire not merely inferior, but sinful outright. The Eretikos stands today as something like a final echo of that older argument. Two positions, both taken seriously, both grounded in genuine philosophical tradition, still actively contending in the centuries after the classical world's own moment had already passed. Let's talk, before we close, about the Olympics. Not the modern version with broadcasting rights and corporate sponsorship, but the original games held every 4 years at Olympia in honor of Zeus, beginning in 776 BCE and continuing without interruption for well over 1,000 years. The ancient Olympics weren't a sporting event with a bit of religion attached to it. They were fundamentally a religious festival that happened to include sport. And like everything else in Greek public life, they operated squarely at the intersection of the sacred, the competitive, and the openly erotic. Imagine arriving at Olympia after days of travel, on roads crowded with pilgrims, merchants, and athletes from every corner of the Greek world. The sanctuary of Zeus is enormous, a walled precinct packed with temples, altars, treasuries, and the sacred olive grove from which victors' crowns were traditionally cut. The atmosphere is overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people, the smoke of sacrifice, the noise of a temporary city that has assembled itself from nothing for this single purpose and will dissolve again within the week. This happened every 4 years, and remarkably, even active wars were suspended for the duration of the games. The Olympics were considered sacred enough that entire armies stood down to let athletes and spectators travel safely across contested territory, which tells you something about how seriously the Greeks took the whole enterprise. Athletes competed naked. This was never treated as remarkable. It was simply the Greek standard for athletic competition, exactly as unremarkable as it was back home at the local gymnasium. The bodies on display at Olympia represented the finest specimens in the entire Greek world. Years of training and selection concentrated into a handful of days of visible public excellence. Every event, the foot races, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, the brutal all-in combat sport called pancration, the chariot races, functioned as a performance of physical perfection before thousands of spectators. And that audience watched, admired, and judged with the full seriousness Greek culture brought to evaluating anything beautiful. Victory at Olympia was genuinely transformative. A victor didn't simply walk away with a crown of olive leaves. He became, for all practical purposes, a hero. His home city celebrated him with processions and public feasts. The finest lyric poets of the age were commissioned to write odes in his honor. Pindar's victory odes, composed to celebrate Olympic champions, rank among the most formally ambitious poems surviving in the Greek language, weaving together mythology and moral philosophy around the simple, central fact of a beautiful young man who had run faster or wrestled better than anyone else alive. Some cities are recorded knocking a section out of their own defensive walls to allow a returning Olympic champion to enter through a new opening rather than the ordinary gate. The idea being that a city capable of producing such a man had no further need of walls to protect it. The erotic dimension running through this culture was entirely explicit, never hidden or apologized for. Pindar's odes dwell openly on the beauty of the victors, their gleaming limbs, their grace in motion. The particular radiance victory seemed to add to an already striking young body. This language wasn't metaphorical decoration. These poems were addressed to real young men, performed at real public celebrations, in a world where everyone in attendance understood perfectly well that the poet's admiration for the victor operated on both an aesthetic and an erotic register simultaneously. Because, in the broader Greek sense, beauty, desire, and philosophical admiration were never treated as separate categories requiring separation. They were a single, continuous response to genuine excellence. Statues of victors were erected both at Olympia and in their home cities. Idealized portraits in bronze and marble, commissioned from the finest sculptors of the age to preserve one specific person's specific excellence in permanent form. The entire tradition of Greek athletic sculpture that produced some of the most celebrated works in Western art. Figures like the discus-throwing Discobolus and the countless courts that still stand in museums worldwide grew directly out of this practice of commemorating real men whose bodies had demonstrated real, witnessed excellence. The sculptures may be idealized, but that idealization was grounded in years of careful, sustained observation of actual bodies in motion. Greek sculptors spent entire careers in gymnasia, simply watching. The Olympics also generated their fair share of scandalous stories, because tens of thousands of people gathering for a week, fueled by intense competitive energy and religious fervor, will inevitably produce material worth talking about. Ancient sources describe athletes celebrated as much for their beauty as for their victories, men pursued by admirers traveling from across the Greek world, who received love poetry alongside their victory odes, and who became, in a culture that placed beauty directly alongside virtue, something remarkably close to what a modern audience would recognize as a celebrity. The key difference is that nobody in that culture pretended the admiration directed at these men was purely aesthetic or purely about athletic achievement. It was understood as all of those things at once, and the Greeks saw no need to untangle the threads. What the Olympics ultimately demonstrate in this context is just how thoroughly desire and excellence were integrated into Greek public life, not as some private undercurrent running beneath respectable events, but as an acknowledged, celebrated, publicly sanctioned dimension of what made competition meaningful in the first place. Spectators weren't simply watching the fastest man alive. They were watching one of the most beautiful men alive demonstrate that beauty through speed, watching Eros and Aphrodite, desire and excellence, operating in the very same body, on the same track, in front of the very same crowd. And the crowd understood exactly what it was watching and cheered for all of it at once. We've covered enormous ground tonight: gymnasium culture, and the Symposium, Sappho and Alexander, the Sacred Band, and painted pottery, and courtroom law cases, and Plato's philosophers. But before we close entirely, it's worth asking the simplest and perhaps most important question of the whole evening directly. What did the ancient Greeks actually believe love was for? Not as a social institution, not as a political tool, not merely as a subject for poetry, but at the deepest level of their thinking about human life. What was the point of all that desire? The answer, once you gather it up from across the different philosophical traditions we've touched on tonight, turns out to be surprisingly consistent and surprisingly large. The Greeks believed love existed to make a person better, not in some soft, sentimental sense, but in a rigorous, demanding, genuinely philosophical one. They believed that love, once it had matured beyond simple physical attraction, was one of the primary mechanisms through which a human being grew into their best possible self. That longing for another person, followed correctly, led a person outward into the world and upward toward wisdom in a way nothing else quite managed to replicate. Diotima's ladder, described in Plato's Symposium, is the most systematic version of this argument, but the same underlying intuition runs throughout Greek thought more broadly. Aristotle, who disagreed with Plato about nearly everything else, shared the conviction deep friendship between people of genuine virtue was essential to living a good life, not a luxury, not an emotional garnish added on top of more important concerns, but genuinely necessary. A person entirely without deep bonds to others, Aristotle wrote, was either a beast or a god, not fully human, missing something essential to what human flourishing actually requires. The fully self-sufficient individual, needing no one else at all, was never the Greek ideal of a good life. It was closer to their definition of something having gone badly wrong. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs somewhat against what the modern world sometimes assumes it inherited from Greek philosophy. The popular image emphasizes reason, logic, self-control, the solitary examined life of the individual mind. All of that is genuinely present in Greek thought, but it coexists just as genuinely with an equally strong conviction that human beings are fundamentally relational creatures, that we become ourselves through our bonds with others, that the deepest wisdom emerges not in isolation, but in conversation, and that desire, love, and the vulnerability of real attachment aren't obstacles standing in the way of the philosophical life, but engines that actually drive it forward. Socrates himself, the philosopher most associated with rigorous, rational self-examination, spent his entire adult life in conversation with other people, in the marketplace, at symposia, following promising young men around and asking them difficult questions until they were forced to think carefully for themselves. He never retreated to a mountaintop. He never withdrew to write in solitude. He lived directly in the thick of human connection, driven by something that looks a great deal like love for Athens, for the people he questioned, for the truth he genuinely believed could only be discovered through real encounter with another mind. The Greeks believed love sharpened a person. That being truly seen by someone else, being known, being challenged, being held to your own best standard by someone whose judgment genuinely mattered to you, produced a kind of growth no amount of private reading or solitary reasoning could ever replicate on its own. The older partner in a mentorship was expected to become a better man through the weight of his responsibilities. The younger partner was expected to become a better man through the model placed in front of him. Friends bound by genuine virtue were expected to push each other steadily toward excellence. And the beloved, in Plato's most idealistic vision, was meant to function as a living reminder of beauty itself, one particular, embodied instance of something universal and eternal, whose presence in your life kept quietly pulling your attention upward toward what actually mattered most. This is what ancient Greece, at its philosophical best, believed love was ultimately for. Not comfort, not security, not simply the satisfaction of desire, though desire was always where it began. Love was for transformation, the slow, difficult, sometimes genuinely painful process of becoming more fully yourself through your encounter with another person who saw you clearly and refused to let you settle for being less than than you were capable of becoming. It was an enormous thing to ask of another human being. It was an enormous thing to offer one in return. And the Greeks, whatever their very real failures and limitations, asked for it and offered it with a seriousness and a beauty the world has been quietly trying to match ever since. So tonight, you've traveled a long way. You've walked through the agora in the early morning light, smelled crushed olives and salt air, and listened to men argue about the nature of beauty until the oil lamps burned low and finally went dark. You've watched the sacred band hold its formation at Chaeronea and read the fragments of a woman on a sun-drenched island who found the exact words for something that had never quite been said so precisely before. You've sat at the edge of a symposium, heard Aristophanes describe round, double creatures cut in half and wandering the earth in search of each other, and felt, somewhere in the quiet part of yourself, that faint shock of recognition that comes when something genuinely ancient turns out to be, essentially, about right now. Ancient Greece was never a paradise. It was a civilization built in part on slavery, on the near-total exclusion of women from public life, on rules that protected some people while ignoring others almost entirely. The freedoms it celebrated were real, but they were real for only a narrow slice of the population, and the cost of those freedoms was quietly paid by people whose names, for the most part, we no longer know. None of that should be softened, and none of it should be forgotten. And yet these were also people who looked directly at desire, at the overwhelming, inconvenient, life-reorganizing force of wanting another person, and decided it was worth thinking about with total seriousness, worth writing about with genuine care, worth building philosophy, poetry, sculpture, and even military strategy around. They never treated love as a distraction from the truly important business of life. They treated it as some of the most important business of life there was. They asked what it was for, where it pointed, and what it might make of a person if followed honestly and well. And they answered those questions with a seriousness and a beauty that 2,500 years still haven't managed to exhaust. Somewhere among the ruins at Olympia, the fragments of Sappho's verse, and the marble lion standing quietly over the grave at Chaeronea, something endures that isn't merely historical. The old ladder diatema described still seems to rise from the beautiful and ordinary towards something that can never quite be fully named. The Symposium's oil lamps went out a very long time ago, but the questions people asked beneath them are somehow still open, still warm, still waiting for whoever happens to pick them up next. So tonight, as you pull the blanket a little closer and let the day finally loosen its grip, maybe carry just one quiet thought with you into sleep, that the desire to truly know another person, to be known by them in return, and to become something better in the light of that knowing. This was never a modern invention, and never a private peculiarity. It is ancient. It is documented. It is carved into marble and painted onto everyday pottery and sung in fragments that somehow survived fire, flood, and the long indifference of centuries, survived, very possibly, precisely because they were too true, too exact, for anyone to ever quite let go of entirely. The Greeks, it turns out, were stubborn like that. So it seems is love. Good night,